Welcome to the StateDefenseForce.com podcast. My name is Justin Stanton, and on today's episode, I have the distinct honor of speaking with the Commanding General of the Georgia State Defense Force, Brigadier General Mark D. Gelhardt, Sr. But before we get started, since this is my first time hosting the State Defense Force podcast, I wanted to give a little background on who I am and why I'm hosting this show. I've served in the Texas State Guard for the past 8 years. I spent 6 of those years in recruiting before moving on to build an initial entry training program for new members. My service provided me with some of the most challenging and rewarding experiences in my life. I've developed a huge amount of respect and admiration for the people who raise their hands and swear their oath to protect and serve the citizens of their states and this nation. It's an undeniable fact that the State Defense Forces are some of the best kept secrets around, and it's my hope that by sharing these discussions with both key leaders of the different components as well as people just starting out in their service, that we can expose the public at large to the missions, opportunities, and rewards that they can find by serving in their own State Defense Force. With that said, it's my privilege to introduce General Mark D. Gelhardt, Sr., Commander of the Georgia State Defense Force. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I enjoy telling stories, and I hope I can tell some useful stories today.
Outstanding. I'm looking forward to it. I've been reading through your biography, and it's just packed with all kinds of interesting information. You started out in ROTC at the University of Florida?
There was a story on how I got into ROTC because I was not a military person. Okay. I was a long-haired hippie in the 70s. And I was not going to go into the service. This was right at the end of Vietnam. I had my draft number, but draft had already stopped. My brothers were both hippies, and I was not going to go into the service, not going to go in that direction. However, because of a young lady, a recruiter, by the way, a ROTC recruiter, a cadet, she talked me into just swinging by and seeing what ROTC was all about. And I figured that I had skills. I had the same skills that they were doing in ROTC. I knew how to hunt. I knew how to fish. I knew how to camp. I knew how to do different things. And my grades weren't that good. So I figured I'd take a course just like basket weaving. In my case, instead of basket weaving, I took ROTC so I could improve my grades. And after 2 years of ROTC, my freshman and sophomore years, I found out I was relatively good at some of the things they asked me to do. I found out I was relatively good and that people would actually listen to what I had to say. I think leaders have a little of born with the skill, and I think leaders learn the skill. Well, I don't think I was really born with the skill, but I think over the years I've learned the skill, and I've improved on what I've had in the past. I joined ROTC because the job market was poor, my grades were bad, and I needed to do something to belong to a team. I wanted esprit de corps. I wanted camaraderie. I wanted fellowship. I joined a fraternity at the same time I joined ROTC, and I spent more time doing ROTC stuff than I did fraternity stuff. And that's what started me on my journey in the military, the fellowship of the soldier, the person, the troop next to you, the things you could share, the things you could do together, and how a team can get a lot more accomplished than an individual. I always thought team sports were great. The Army is the best team sport there is. So I started in ROTC. That got me into the service, and then I went straight into exciting things. I went into the 82nd Airborne Division, jumped out of airplanes, went to winter warfare school in Alaska, parachuted on the Mount McKinley, now Mount Takali, lived off the land at minus 40-degree weather for 2 weeks, and winter warfare school. Absolutely hated it, but enjoyed what I learned. Came back from that, and they wanted to send me someplace cold. I said, I don't want to go someplace cold. I said, what school can I go to that will take that away? And they say, well, if you go to Jungle Expert School, you don't have to go to someplace cold. So I volunteered again to go to Jungle Expert School in Panama, jumped into the Panamanian jungle and lived off the land, eating snakes and bugs and grubs for 2 weeks and hiked my way out as we attacked targets. So I had a rather unique start because it sounds like I was an infantry guy, and I wasn't. I'm an HR guy. I'm an adjutant general. I'm a paper pusher. I've always been a paper pusher. I'm an IT geek, communications guy, intelligence guy, paper pusher. But I've probably got more field time than most normal infantry and combat armed soldiers. because I ended up going from unique assignment to unique assignment to unique assignment because I kept volunteering for what no one else wanted. And that's part of the story about the State Defense Force, volunteerism, doing something for others while you're doing something for yourself. I continue to volunteer for more than 20 years of active service. That volunteer process took me all the way to the White House. I volunteered to work at the White House. I was turned down several times. I set my own career. I went directly to the decision maker and said, hey, I want to come work for you at the White House. And they said, this is not the way it's done. I said, this is the type of person you're going to get if you hire me. I found out what his private phone number was, what his private fax machine number was. I found out what he drank for coffee in the morning. I found out when his secretary wasn't going to be at the desk to answer his private phone. And I called him directly while I faxed him my packet for the White House while I talked to him on the phone. I said, give me 5 minutes and I'll convince you I'm the person you want to work for you. He gave me 5 minutes. He said, this is not the way it's done. And I go, that's fine. My packet's in your fax machine behind you next to your half-filled black coffee cup that's right next to your fax machine. If you don't think I'm the right person, that's okay. He goes, how did you know what coffee I drink? How did you know what color my coffee cup is? How do you know what my fax machine was? How do you know what my private phone number is? And I said, that's the type of officer you're going to get if you hire me. Well, long story short, I got hired. Worked there for 5 years with President Clinton as the head of the information technology services at the White House, managing all the classified communications. One thing led to another. I got to the end of my military career, and I ended up in Georgia. That's where my wife wanted to go. She had followed me for more than 20 years around the world. I said, where do you want to end up? She wanted to go back to Georgia. We had been here before. And we got to Georgia, got out of the service. I went into the civilian sector, became a CIO of an airline, double, triple my salary from the military service because we don't serve for money. We serve because of pride. We serve because of country. But I got out and I lost the camaraderie. I lost the fellowship. I lost the leadership. I was working in the civilian sector with people that were CEOs of companies, that were leaders of companies, and had no concept of what taking care of the troop, taking care of the individual employee was, taking care of the soldier. And I lost that. So I looked around in my community and I said, what can I do to give me the fix I need? So I joined the volunteer fire department. I had joined volunteer fire departments throughout my military career. I spent more than 30 years as a volunteer firefighter supporting local communities. There is no bigger rush than helping someone on the side of the road that thinks there's nothing for them. So I love helping people, and that's what brought me to the State Defense Force.
Wow, that is an incredible story. I identify with a lot of things that you added in there. I never served in federal service, but I did do ROTC when I was in college at the University of Texas. And that camaraderie, that experience there, I think is what actually eventually led me to come back to find a State Defense Force as well. How long has it been since you retired from active service?
I've been out of service for 20 years. I retired 9/11. So I retired on September 2001, right at the exact same time 9/11 happened.
Wow.
So I thought I was going to get called back off of my retirement leave and get stopgapped and stay in the service. But because of my background and who I was, they didn't mess with me. They allowed me to retire. And I turned around and actually volunteered to come back on active service if I was needed during the different conflicts after. But as you get older, the young studs need to go to the field, not the old guys.
So you've also served with the Civil Air Patrol. You've served with volunteer fire departments. The Georgia State Defense Force is obviously not your only outlet for volunteer service.
Every individual only has so much time to give to be a volunteer. So yes, I belong to a lot of different organizations, but there's only so many weekends. There's only so many nights, and you can only give of yourself so much. So as I balance the different organizations, I'm also the commander of the American Legion post. I'm a trustee of a Veterans of Foreign Wars post. I'm in the Rotary I'm in the Kiwanis Club, but I only have so much time. So as I spend more time with one organization, other organizations get less. I've retired from the fire department. I can no longer carry out a 200-pound firefighter with full pack and gear out of the smokehouse if he was down. And if I can't help my brothers in the time of need, then I need to let someone else that has that skill set do that. So I've retired from the fire department. I still provide support to other volunteer agencies when I have time. Now that I've become the commanding general of the State Defense Force, I have reduced dramatically my support to several other organizations because this is taking up all my time. And I told my wife, I said, for 2 to 3 to 4 years, I'm going to spend 90+% of my time. By the way, I still have a full-time job. So I work full-time as I'm doing these volunteer things, but I have a very understanding boss. I have a very understanding company that supports me. And every time I tell them, well, I'll just retire and do this stuff full-time, they said, no, we still want you to stay. We'll give you the time you need. So I highly encourage anybody that's listening to this podcast. If you want to give back to your community, there's many ways to do it. The State Defense Force is just one of many. So if the State Defense Force isn't right for you, try some of the other things. If some of these other things aren't right for you, try the State Defense Force. Sooner or later, you're going to find the people, the camaraderie, the skill sets that match, and it will give you the return you need. You will be happy because you're doing things for your community. You'll be happy because you're doing things for the state. You'll see things, news articles in the paper showing how your organization did. And later on in this podcast, we're going to talk about what the Georgia State Defense Force did for the state of Georgia during the COVID issues. And we'll talk about how this organization provided direct, needed support to the state at no cost to the state. An individual that has time to volunteer needs to decide what they want to volunteer for. And I'm going to try to convince you that the State Defense Force is what you need to volunteer for right now. And we'll talk about why.
Speaking of the Georgia State Defense Force, let's go ahead and get into that. Can you give us a little background on the history of the Georgia State Defense Force?
The National Guard that we know today is the Minutemen of old. And they've changed. They've got new missions. They can get federalized now after World War II. But what happens when your state's National Guard has to deploy to Afghanistan or to some other country, and a tornado or a hurricane or a flood hits your community? If you have no National Guard to support the governor, what happens to your community? You only have first responders. So the state guard comes from the old 1600s farmer that put down his rake and picked up a weapon to support his community. They not only put down a rake to pick up a weapon, they put down a rake to pick up a hammer to build a church. They put down a rake to pick up a hammer to build a house, to build a schoolhouse, to build a granary where the whole community could use it. The Georgia State Defense Force goes back to the creation of the state of Georgia, just like every other state defense force. And we are here through that time of becoming a state to helping the governor and helping the state in their time of need. In this case, in time of emergencies, such as hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, ice-pocalypse days. And we have all sorts of stories of how the State Defense Force in uniform stood right next to your National Guard. You, the citizen, couldn't tell the difference because we're the same. We have the same standards. We have the same abilities. And I would even say yet we have more abilities than the National Guard does because of the background of our organization. But we came from the old days where people would come together in a community and support their community. That's what the State Defense Force is.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with your statement about we have more abilities because of the background of the members. And what I've found to be true in my own State Defense Force is that because we take people at a later stage in life, people that serve in a state guard typically are between 35 to 50 years of age. They have some sort of establishment in life. educational background, family.